so that it doesn't take as much energy to stay in that position. We find that our chronic pain has very much to do with changes in the structure, in the way that these collagen fibers are layering, and you can see that there's a three-dimension to this one, where they're in not only layers, but there's layers upon layers here. And you can see that there's things actually clumping up. There's not only gel in there that's slowing down our interstitial fluid, there's the fibers themselves start to snarl up and start to fold in on each other. There's like a fascia lasagna that ends up happening here in this picture. The difference between these two pictures here has a lot to do with what happens when there's no more movement of, there's layers that slide on each other. As I move my arm like this, there's layers underneath that are sliding past each other, and I need to have a nice, good fluid movement of not only just my muscles, but there's layers that need to slide in between sections of my body, or sections of my arm or my leg. They need to be able to slide without problems. As soon as you stop moving, the body thinks that you need to maintain that posture. You lay down at night and go to sleep. Hopefully you get 8 hours of sleep. And that 8 hours is enough for the fibroblast cells that realign and reroute to create something new. So that's why you feel really stiff in the morning. And one of the most well-known videos is by Gil Hedley, and it's called the Fuzz Speech. And he talks about the fact that when you're laying down at night, these surfaces that normally would slide past each other like this, they are no longer sliding right now. So there's fibers that shoot across the gap between two sliding surfaces, and it creates, as you separate them, it looks like fuzz in between the layers. So collagen fibers are always changing. They're always rerouting based off of the current situation. Current situation meaning if you're like that for a certain number of hours, the body thinks that that's what you need and that's what you want. So it starts to seize up the sliding surfaces. So that's why in the morning it's really, really good to stretch, because you're really tight. And then you're starting to take those sliding surfaces and rip apart those new formed collagen fibers that now try to keep those two sliding layers together. Gil Hedley calls those the fuzz. So even if I was to break my arm and I was to put a cast right here, now I've seized those sliding layers and the muscle groups and all of those things, and more specifically the superficial layer. I've seized them all up for a very long period of time, and you start to get scarring and adhesions and breaking and folding and creasing of the collagen fibers. And that creates a problem. That's where most of the things that we feel underneath the skin, we palpate for. We can feel knots, we can feel lumps and bumps, and we can feel really, really hard areas that should be soft. It's the collagen fibers and the fluids that are in that same space that are causing most of these problems. They're compressing our nervous system. They're causing pain. They're compressing our cardiovascular system and causing blood pressure changes. They're compressing the ability for our lymphatic system to bring in the interstitial fluids and recycling them and getting them out of the space. It's basically like edema throughout our entire body. We're going to talk about that a lot through our training. So not a good thing to stay not moving for a long period of time. The idea of being in a cast for 6 weeks and never moving that part of the body, that will stick with you for the rest of your life. We've dealt with clients that have had an injury 30 years ago, and you think that everything's good on the surface, but in reality, if we were to remove our skin and we were to see underneath that skin layer, the outer dermis layer, we would see a history like the rings of a tree. We would see a history of every bump and bruise, and we would look at a certain fascial scarring and look at a certain part of our body and go, oh yeah, I remember that. That's when I ran into the coffee table, or that's when I fell off my bike when I first started learning to ride it. We would see a history of everything, because you're born with perfect fascia, barring any birth defects or changes to the way your body has built itself. Barring that, you're built with perfect fascia, and then everything changes and you scar it and the adhesions, and we think that we're moving without pain and everything's good, that our body goes back to the way it should be, that we were born with. That's simply not the fact. We usually don't think that anything's wrong until there's pain, or there's a reduction in motion, range of motion. But we know that to be different now, because we're much older. We have other things happening here, fluids coming, too much fluid in these spaces. We have less mobility. We lead sedentary lives. We eat foods that are really, really not good for us and create more and more problems in our interstitial space. And then they become chronic. So that is the plight of our clients when they come in. And we can do something about that by understanding how these tuning forks work, and how fascia and the fluids that are inside that fascia, superficial fascia space, how they work. And then the fascia itself, we see a couple other pictures here. Fascia is in different collagen fibers. This is immunostaining. Again, you see that there are different colors here running in different directions. Again, think three-dimensional here. And then there's fibers that are much smaller than other fibers. You see that there's some dots here. Those are the fibroblasts. The fibroblasts are kind of like ants in an ant colony. They create a lot of stuff, but they're very small, and they're always moving around and going to where they need to, and then taking care of this business and creating fascia collagen fibers across this way to pull it tight, and then creating more proteoglycans and gel to keep this area flowing correctly. And then we have really, really defined ways that our collagen fibers will align themselves, especially in our earlobes and our muscle groups, the tendons. If you need something that's very, very tight, you may have what's called an aponeurosis, which is not a condition. It's actually a part of your body. Our aponeurosis that we have, that we know quite a bit about, is at the very bottom of your foot. What's usually called plantar fascia is actually an aponeurosis, and it would be a sheet like this of collagen fibers that have been put and oriented in a certain way that doesn't leave much room for elasticity. It's very tight. It's meant to be tight. It's under strain all the time, so that you can have the arch underneath your foot, or this IT band that we have along the side of our thigh, that allows us to have stability in our leg, and it's meant to be tight all the time. So again, it's not only the collagen fibers themselves, but how they're oriented and how much elasticity they have is going to determine on whether it's a ligament, a tendon at the end of a muscle group, if it's fascia surrounding a muscle group to allow for the muscles to work the way that they do, or the aponeurosis that create constant tension, or it's just the layer underneath our dermis layer, our skin, that allows our entire body to stay in a posture or to move a certain way efficiently and still have all the things happening within that layer. And then when it comes to the collagen, the substance, the solid parts of us, then there's the fluids that happen. We're going to talk a lot about fluids and fascia. Fluids and fascia, it's going to be, you can't have one without the other. So in the structure that we have just underneath our skin, if I was to take an ultrasound paddle and I was to put it right on my skin right here, and I'm taking a slice from top to bottom underneath my skin on this arm. What I would be seeing here with immunostaining, you're able to see different densities of collagen here. We see the darker pink is just a much denser collagen layers, and they are in layers. They're layered on top of each other. And then, of course, the collagen fibers are actually woven in on each other. With immunostaining and ultrasound, very high definition ultrasound, we can see layers here, and then we can get down to this white area right here. We see the white area is actually fluid. It's fluid pockets. There's fluid in between those layers. It's in the interstitial space. We also call this the extracellular space. It's fluids outside of our cells. It's coming, the fluid is plasma that's coming out of our cardiovascular system. The arteries, it's coming out of the arteries. And it's designed to be able to allow fluids, that fluid from our arteries through the capillaries and then capillary walls, to be able to feed our cells in a given space, or provide oxygen, or provide chemicals of some sort. And then, but there's pockets of fluid that end up that end up pooling. So these white areas here really is what we consider localized edema. We're going to talk quite a bit about understanding that when fluids do not get removed from the space, and there's not a balance of your arteries and the capillaries pushing the plasma fluids out, and pushing more fluids out than is being pulled out of the space by the lymphatic system or the veins, you start to get too much fluid. And this is our theory, and this is what we have seen with our VFRT work, that everybody that we've seen has been in some form of edema, meaning there's more fluids in the spaces that need to be there. They're compartmentalized, they're compressed, they're overpressurizing things. When overpressurization happens, blood pressure goes up, blood flow changes. You have even a greater inability to have your lymphatic system bring the fluids in so it can remove it from the space. It's like a sump pump that has failed. Then right down here in these very large white areas, you see that there are some, it looks like little circles down here. These are actually your fat or your adipose cells. They're balls of triglycerides or lipids. They live within our interstitial or our extracellular matrix that's made up by the collagen fibers. They're a specialized fascia cell, and they live in here. If you notice in between the different fascia collagen fibers, they start to collect here. It's all part of the same layer. It's mostly the superficial layer that has the adipose cells in there. Notice that when you see all of these adipose cells, you also see a lot of large white areas next to it. We know that that's fluid. It shouldn't be this way. There is a documented association between fat cells and edema, localized edema. And if you've ever seen anybody or talked to anybody that's had an accumulation of too much fat in one area, too many fat cells, you know that they also have accompanied fluid retention, swelling. All of those terms are still the same thing. Too much interstitial fluid in between those spaces. And when you have a lot of adipose cells, you tend to have a lot of free-flowing fluids, which isn't something that should be there. Fluids that come out of our cardiovascular system should move slow, because if my hand is a cell and I want to grab on, I have little feelers out here in my cell, and it's grabbing onto something that's floating past it, something that it needs, nutrition of some sort. It needs oxygen. It needs a specific chemical that's going to land in its feelers that are outside the cell, that are going through the cell wall. and it wants that fluid and the chemicals and the things in the fluids to float past it very slowly, so that the lock for the key in your cell walls are waiting for certain things. If that fluid that comes out of your cardiovascular system is too fast, like floating through this open fluid space, then you're going to have problems. The cells are not going to be nourished. They're not going to be oxygenated. They're going to have less water in them. You're going to have problems. The cells will not be able to act the way that they need to or operate efficiently. When I showed the picture back here, that all this gel is here. This gel is all part of the ability to slow down the fluids when they come out of the cardiovascular system. You want to be able to have the fluids flow past our cells that need the stuff in our plasma. It needs to be able to feed from it. Well, if things are flying past like rapids, then they're not going to be able to feed very, very well. We're going to have problems. This is where cells go wrong. This is where cancer happens. This is where, you have toxicities of certain things. So we really want the gel to be there the right way, but we don't want areas here that have pockets of fluid. And even though we may think that we're just retaining water, or we just have a little bit of swelling, or you may not realize that you have edema in these layers, and that's part of the problem. Most of us are having edema of some sort, and once that happens, there's a problem with your lymphatic system and the ability to have the fluids removed. And a lot of times they get compartmentalized and pressurized, and there's where a lot of our pain is at. Not only that, but these collagen fibers can get too tight in a certain area because now there's fluid, and now there's broken and crimped and snarled up fibers that are pinching onto our nervous system and causing pain as well. So I've created this loop called the ILF loop, and it really is to see this interaction between the interstitial fluid, the fascia that's there with the interstitial fluid. They go together. So when one has problems, it causes the other to have problems. When one's operating correctly, the